to this presentation today. Yesterday, I spoke about carnism, the psychology of eating animals, which is a talk for a general audience. It's for meat eaters, vegans, vegetarians, the general public. In this talk, it's specifically geared toward vegans and vegetarians who are moving toward veganism. And it's about effective vegan advocacy. So it's understanding the psychology of eating animals for effective vegan advocacy. Now, did you have a chance to look at this quote a little bit? I mean, I chose it because I think it really best captures that classic tension that marks the human response to suffering, right? It's that conflict or that tension between, awareness and denial, between, numbing and witnessing, between turning away and speaking out. So really, this is a quote by Judith Herman, who's a renowned psychiatrist. She's a specialist in psychological trauma. And as Judith Herman points out, most people respond to suffering or to atrocities by turning away. But some people are willing to see the truth of what's happening. And these people often feel compelled to speak out and break through the denial of others. These are the activists and advocates who are on the front lines of a social movement whose goal it is to attract a critical mass of supporters in order to tip the scales of power. I mean, these people are you. And you're in good company. I mean, what is a revolutionary if not one who speaks out against injustice? And one day, and I believe this day is actually going to come sooner than I used to think, just a few years ago, when the vegan movement has achieved popular support, then vegans are not going to be viewed as radicals, but are going to really be recognized as heroes. So the question is, how do we do this? How do we bring this about? And I want to start out by asking you a little bit about your own experience. So, do you notice as vegans that people turn away when you try to talk to them about the truth of eating animals? Right? Sort of like, don't tell me that, you'll ruin my meal. Do you also relate to what Judith Herman says, that you feel compelled to speak out? And so then, okay, well, when you do speak out, how do people typically respond? Like the average response? They say, okay, thank you for enlightening me. I'm never eating animals again. I just made the connection. Right, so often people don't, you'd think that this would be, veganism would be such a quote unquote easy sell. We're advocating compassion. We're advocating moral consistency. We're advocating health. As Gary pointed out before, the vast majority of people genuinely care about animals and do not want to cause them harm. Unfortunately, simply teaching people the truth is obviously not enough to bring about change. Otherwise, the world would in fact be vegan now. It's very important, in my opinion, to not simply talk about the ideology of veganism as though it's divorced from the psychology of the people who make up the broader social culture. When we look at ideology devoid of psychology, we can make the mistake of assuming that all we need to do is tell people the facts and tell people what's happening, and then they're just going to change. If that were the case, the world would, in my opinion, be vegan. So I'm guessing that most of you can relate to this image. When you're vegan for a while, and this goes on and on and on, and you just think, I remember when I first became vegan, when I first learned, I was actually a vegetarian first, and at that point I became very outspoken. It was a long time ago, it was in the 1980s, and I hadn't made the connection between dairy and animal suffering, as many people don't right away. But I was horrified at what I learned about what happened to the animals, and I, of course, wanted to share this with the people in my life who I was closest to. People like myself, who were rational, caring people, at least I had thought they were, and nobody I talked to wanted to hear what I had to say. Instead, I was the crazy one for not wanting to eat dead animals anymore. It was really kind of crazy-making, and that's what motivated me to do the research that I did to really understand, this is not... How do we do this? How do we create real, substantial change for animals, given that we're dealing with people, all of us, who have a very messy psychology? We're not purely rational, logical people. I mean, we have a plethora of scientific evidence today demonstrating that most people don't make choices because their rational mind has told them it's the right thing to do. I mean, otherwise we'd all be going to the gym regularly and never eat potato chips and do a whole lot of other things. People are complicated, and psychology is complex and messy. And so what I want to talk about today is how we can navigate around this psychology, how we can bring people from denial to awareness as effectively and quickly as possible. So the first question we need to ask are, like, what are the obstacles that prevent our message from getting out there? What are the obstacles that prevent us from advocating effectively? And I would suggest that there are 3 key obstacles to effective vegan advocacy. One is that this whole mentality of meat is really structured to block or defend against our message. And many of you here today are already familiar with my work on the psychology of eating meat, so I'm going to just very briefly touch upon this. Another reason is that we simply lack formal training in communication and advocacy strategies. I mean, most of us don't learn, we learn how to add and subtract and do a variety of things that can be very useful in the real world in school, but we don't learn how to communicate with others so that we can actually have healthy, connected relationships and communications. It's astounding to me. And so even outside of veganism, where veganism is, we have all this charge and this defensiveness and this intensity that's kind of already built into the conversation, most of us in our day-to-day conversations haven't really learned when we're talking about, especially about any kind of emotional issue or disagreement, how to actually communicate about that in a way that increases the chances our message will be heard the way we intend it to be heard. And the third reason is because our own psychological state can have a negative impact on advocacy if we don't recognize and attend to our needs. How many of you can relate to that, where you're talking about veganism and you can just feel inside of you that you're like, it's just wanting to bubble out and you're just trying to keep smiling? Yeah, I get my protein from plant sources. It's not that difficult, really. Right? So, and as time goes on and we become increasingly frustrated, if we don't understand the psychology of eating animals, the psychology of the people we're advocating to, we can become very judgmental and make assumptions about their character, what kind of a person they are. We can become misanthropic, get very frustrated about humanity. We can become increasingly traumatized from witnessing, slaughter videos, images that keep popping up on our Facebook page. These emotions can build up over time if we're not really mindful and taking care of ourselves. Our emotions can end up hijacking us and our conversations and really prevent people from hearing what we have to say. People can feel when there's an emotional charge. I mean, I'm sure you know this. This isn't to say that we have to be perfect, but if we don't take care of ourselves, we're going to get in our own way, and we're just going to be kind of miserable in the process. And we're animals too, and we deserve not to suffer. So the good news is that with awareness and practice of all of these things, we can significantly increase the likelihood that our message will be heard as we intend it to be. So let's briefly talk about the mentality of meat. Now, the mentality of meat is organized to block people's, non-vegans, awareness of what psychologists refer to as their cognitive moral dissonance. Cognitive moral dissonance is the internal discomfort we feel when our values are not in alignment with our practices or our behaviors. We all know what it feels like to feel cognitive moral dissonance. I mean, nobody here is perfect, nor can we be. I'm wearing my, vegan shoes that were probably made by 5-year-old children in China somewhere, and I don't feel good about it. That's just something that I'm living with in my life at the moment. So this is what cognitive moral dissonance is. I'm going to give you an example of a quote from a meat eater I interviewed for my doctoral dissertation on the psychology of eating meat. I was going through my checklist and asking her, so do you eat, processed foods? Do you eat packaged food? It was a variety of different questions. And I said, okay, so do you eat meat? And when I asked her this question, she got quiet, and then she responded and said, there are so many mortifying things in our culture and society, but killing animals for food certainly is one of the worst. And people ignore it the most because they think that animals don't matter. I feel a lot for these animals. Just the thought is really upsetting. And she just sat there and started crying in front of me. No provocation from me. So what do we do about our moral discomfort when we feel it? How can we alleviate it? Well, we have 3 choices. What do you think they are? You're going to, right? Well, one thing is we can just change our values, right? We could just say like, well, you know what? I'm kind of a jerk. I don't care about animals. I don't care about the suffering of others. I'm just a selfish, not a very nice person. Most people are not going to do that. We have research demonstrating that people need to maintain a moral sense of self. Everybody needs to think that they're living an essentially moral life. Another option, if we don't change our values, what else can we do? Yeah, we can change our actions or our behaviors, right? Which means we go vegan. As we know, more often than not, this is not the case when people are first presented with information about animal agriculture. But then there's a third option. And when it comes to eating animals, and probably many, many things, this is the most common option. We can change our perception of our behavior, so it doesn't look like we're living a contradictory life. Make sense? So this is what carnism is organized around, okay? So I'm going to give you one quick slide on carnism, the invisible belief system that conditions people to eat certain animals. Now, carnism is the opposite of veganism. It is a sub-ideology of speciesism, just like anti-Semitism, for example, is a sub-ideology of racism. It's illogical. It distorts people's perceptions so they can eat animals and not see any contradiction between their values and their behaviors. It's obviously a violent ideology, and it's maintained by these specific psychological and social defense mechanisms that distort perceptions, and they also numb feelings. And it's institutionalized and internalized. So what this means when I say internalized, when we're born into a dominant system such as carnism, we inevitably look at the world through the lens of carnism. So these carnistic defenses they're almost automatic in people. So, I mean, maybe you've experienced this. You say you're vegan, and just saying you're vegan is enough for people to, like, you get what I'm talking about? I mean, they're literally automatic responses. Not everybody responds that way, but it's not uncommon. And it's not because the people you're talking to are necessarily nasty, uncompassionate people. I mean, chances are they're actually more compassionate than they even realize, which is why they need to defend themselves against recognizing their cognitive moral dissonance in the first place. So I want to move on now and really focus on the heart of this presentation, which is advocacy strategies. What are some specific ways that we can navigate around carnistic defenses? The first one is to focus on the process, not the content of a conversation. The content of the conversation is the what, right? It's what you're talking about, whether to stay in or go out with your partner on a Saturday night, whether to eat animals or to be vegan. That's the content. The process of the conversation is the how. It's far more, psychologists who have, and people who have researched communication specialists have found that people tend to respond far more to the process than they do to the content. They tend to actually remember the process more than they remember the content. Think about conversations you've had where you might have no idea what you were actually talking about with somebody, or just a very general idea, but you know the feeling you had. You know if you felt disrespected. You know if you felt that person was open to you and curious about what you had to say. The process is the how. It's how we talk about the issue, and the how matters. It matters very, very much. It is not enough to just tell people this is what is happening. Any psychologist will tell you, and many people who are not psychologists will tell you, the facts do not sell the ideology. And I'll repeat this over and over again today because I feel so strongly about it. So make your goal to share the truth of your experience rather than to be right. In a healthy communicative process, the goal of the conversation is for you to get the other person to understand your thoughts and feelings. Our language is the only way we have, or the main way we have, to communicate what's happening inside of us. The goal of my communication with you is so you understand my thoughts and my feelings about the issue, largely my thoughts, because I'm up here. If I'm talking to you one-on-one, it would be probably more feeling-based. And it's also reciprocal. The goal of a healthy conversation is to understand the other's thoughts and feelings. What is the truth of their experience, and for them to understand your thoughts and feelings and your needs and your hopes. If your goal is to be right, what does that mean for the other person? You make them wrong. Nobody wants to be made wrong, and we don't have to make people wrong. That's the thing. People are far more receptive when we communicate information that we have without having this agenda to say, see, I told you, now you're going to change. Adults don't like to feel controlled. Most people don't like to feel controlled. Controlling conversation is conversation that's structured to convince the other people, to convince another person to do what we want them to do. With veganism, we don't have to do that. We don't have to. We are starting with a foundation that is already doing it for us. People care about animals. People care about their health. People want to do the right thing generally. We don't have to put a gun to their head and force them to do it. What we do need to do is encourage them to open their hearts and minds so that they can take in information that they have been taught to be defended against. Now, I just gave you like a 2-minute description of effective communication. If we learn, I personally believe, if we learn effective communication, it is one of the most transformational things that we can do as individuals, as partners in relationships, as members of families, as friends, as society, and as activists and advocates. Some people say, well, communication is just really superficial. It's just how you talk. However, to effectively communicate, it's not just choosing your words strategically. It's creating an attitude and an orientation that allows you to truly connect with and be connected with another. And that shifts psychology. It's incredibly powerful. The book that I recommend is called Messages. It's kind of a big book, but you can pick and choose parts of it. It's in all my research on communications. It's the best book that I've found. If you read some of the principles in this book, I can assure you, you will have some excellent tools for talking about some of these very complicated issues. A healthy process is a healthy process, so it doesn't matter whether you're debating to stay in and go out on Saturday night or to eat or not eat animals. The process should always look the same. Now, especially when it comes to veganism, one very effective way to communicate about the issue is to share your own story. And this is something that I do. It doesn't matter who I'm talking to about veganism. I could be talking to an audience of 800 meat eaters. I could be talking on, a live radio show. All of my advocacy is through my own story. Nobody can disagree with your story. It's your story. Nobody can make your story wrong. So when people ask me, as they often do, they might hear the title of my book and they say, "So you're a vegan?" And I say, yeah, I'm vegan, and this is why. And I share my story. Like most people, many people, I grew up with a dog who I really felt connected to, and I also grew up eating animals, and for so much of my life, I didn't make that connection. And you don't have to have had a relationship with a dog. We all share more in common. We all have more in common than not when it comes to this issue. Most people, they feel compassion and they care about justice. Share your own story, but this is what I learned. We don't have to hit people over the head with our facts. When you share your own story, people look at the world through your eyes. They're witnessing through you. It's kind of like what artists do when they paint paintings of, atrocities or something. They're asking, or filmmakers can do. They're allowing the other to look at the world through their eyes and to see what they see, and sometimes it's safer to witness that way. Now, within sharing your own story, or just even in general, it's really important to find common ground. Good or effective communication is all about connection, feeling connected with one another. Now, to share with you how one way for us to do this, I just want to take a quick poll here. How many of people in this room have ever, in your lives in the past, used to eat meat, eggs, and or dairy? Just curious. Look around the room. Okay, so when we become vegan, it's so easy to forget that we ever looked at the world another way. It's in some ways it's because it's just such a profound paradigm shift. The world looks so fundamentally different. you kind of wake up, and it's so easy to forget that you were exactly the same in many ways as the people that you're advocating to. We didn't, but one of the most important things we have in common with the people we're advocating to is our own carnism. We are bilingual. They are not. It's not fair that we have to work so hard to bridge the differences and to communicate effectively. It's not fair, but it's true. When people ask me if I'm vegan, I always answer by saying, today I am, but for much of my life I wasn't. For much of my life I ate meat. And I even share the truth that I was like the meat lover's pizza girl, and I really was. And you can feel there's like a palpable when I say that, you get me. People need to feel understood, and they deserve to feel understood. And it's a lot easier for us, too, if we can remember our own carnism, because we stop relating to them like they're fundamentally different than we are, and start relating to them like they haven't made the same connections or been ready to make the same change that we have. And this dramatically increases the chances that you'll be able to have a productive conversation rather than a defensive argument. We can also illuminate carnistic defenses. And to do this directly or indirectly. Carnistic defenses are these psychological defense mechanisms that I've been referring to. One of the main defenses is dissociation, just not making the connection between meat and the living being it once was, for example. Carnistic defenses lose much of their power when they're exposed. So one way to do this is I do this through my own story. I'll say, I, like many people, I grew up with a dog, and I just never, it's weird, I just never made the connection. I really cared about my dog. I cared about animals, and yet I was eating animals every single day. And it was so strange. When I was eating meat, I didn't think, I'm eating a dead animal. It was just food to me. It was just I had this knowing without knowing. And I can tell you, every time I talk to somebody about this, and I share my own experience of my own carnistic defenses, they're like, yeah, me too. Yeah, I do that too. I don't think about the animal when I'm eating meat. And I'll be like, really? Why not? What is it like for you? Why not? Oh my God, because if I did, I'd be disgusted. It's like eating dead flesh. I'm like, yeah, but by sharing our own experience of defenses, it lowers people's carnistic defenses. When we illuminate them, it makes them they lose much of their power, right? I might say, I used to think eating animals was normal, natural, and necessary. And then I realized that these are myths, all through my story. And coming back again to what I've been saying, don't expect the facts to sell the ideology. They don't. We cannot, the animals cannot afford for us to practice ideology devoid of psychology. Often these ideas are promoted by people who are maybe philosophers, or they're, longtime activists. It's understandable that people would feel this way. I have yet to meet a psychologist or somebody who really understands human psychology and motivation for change, who would advocate this kind of approach. We have tremendous amounts of literature that demonstrate it just doesn't work. Companies have spent billions of dollars trying to understand how to get people to do what they want that person to do, even when it's in the person's interest. And it is not simply about telling people the truth. We think if we tell people the truth, they'll never want to eat animals again. More often than not, they're at the McDonald's drive-thru the next day. So people do not change, typically, until they bear witness, right? Until they open their minds and they open their hearts and allow themselves to make enough of a connection that it no longer feels appropriate for them to be eating animals. We cannot make somebody ready for change. People change when they're ready. If the world were in a different place, I think when the vegan movement is more evolved, we'll be able to work more on legislative initiatives that force change in some ways, but at the moment we don't have that. At the moment we're working with one-to-one, we're working with advocacy and outreach. So we need to appreciate the meaning of meat. Asking someone to stop eating meat, eggs and dairy, is not simply asking for a change of behavior. It's asking for a shift of consciousness. A shift of consciousness that doesn't happen until a person is ready to. We are asking people to undo a lifetime of programming. We're asking people to question authorities that they had put their trust in. We're asking people to become members of a minority group and no longer part of the majority, which to some of us who are vegan might even be attractive, at least not terribly intimidating, but for some people that can feel overwhelming. We're asking people to risk relationships. Now, relationships do not have to suffer when one person becomes vegan, but because we're not really relationally trained, very often becoming vegan causes a lot of disruption in our relationships. Can you relate to some of that? And it's not easy, it's exhausting. And I'm actually working on another presentation specifically on that issue. That's another presentation. People need to be ready for that. I had a woman come to my talk once. I was talking about carnism, and she came up to me afterwards, and she was in tears. She was weeping, and she said, I agree with everything you said, and it's horrible what's happening. I don't want to be a part of it. And I'm married to a man who is like, he was working in the meat industry, and I've got 3 young children, and I'm completely dependent on him economically, and I can't break my family up. And I know if I become vegan, it's going to destroy my family. Now, maybe it wouldn't have destroyed her family. Who am I to say? I don't know. She wasn't ready. She would have made the change, I have no doubt, if her life situation had been different. So people need to be in a state of readiness. They need to be psychologically ready, socially ready, and ready on a practical level. You know, if you're a single mother with 4 kids and you're working, 2 jobs and putting yourself through school at night, it's probably not a very practical time for you. You're probably not going to be very open to veganism. So as activists, one of the things that I believe is very important for us to do is to make it easier to become vegan. So we lower the defenses when we make it easier to become vegan. People don't worry about becoming a part of a minority group because the vegan group it's larger. We're less of a minority. Vegan foods are more accessible. It's more practically accessible. They don't worry about getting teased and ostracized because veganism is more normalized. We also need to separate character from behavior. I personally find using words like wrong and bad and just not productive in conversations. They're judgments, they're loaded with moral judgments. And I know Gary spoke earlier about how important it is to have judgment when it comes to social justice. And I would say that if we're talking about a judgment about a social behavior that we want to change, that's quite different than judging the people that are engaging in that social behavior. Even if we believe in our minds that the other person is wrong or bad or morally inferior, which I would suggest we not believe in our minds because they're, like I said, human psychology is very complex, and creating this sort of moral hierarchy can cause a lot of problems for ourselves and our own personal growth as well as for the movement. But even if we believe this, it's not strategic to judge people. It doesn't work. You know what it feels like to be on the receiving end of judgment. When you're judging somebody, you're looking at them as less than, regardless as to what the category is. When you're on the receiving end of judgment, you are looking at yourself through the other's eyes, and you're seeing yourself as less than or as inferior in one way or another. It's a shaming behavior, and shamed people typically are not people who become proactive in healthy change. Shamed people typically withdraw and do nothing or attack in self-defense. So we need to separate character from behavior. My computer just went off. There we go. If we understand carnism, we can understand that good people do harmful things and it doesn't make them bad people. We're all born into these systems. I know so many vegans who are not active in examining their own participation in other isms that I think are vitally important isms. Many vegans who are not looking at their participation in racism, for example, they might think about it, kind of conceptually and say, well, yeah, of course, racism, speciesism, we're fighting for liberation, but not in their day-to-day lives. In their day-to-day lives, they're exercising their white privilege and remaining blind to it in ways that maintain a racist system that is deeply problematic and divisive. Does it make them bad people? No, we are born into this system. We're born into a racist system that unfortunately is has a powerful impact on all of us. Should we commit to examining our participation in it? Absolutely. I'm saying that people who eat animals, they're born into this carnistic system. I think about my mother, who's kind of like now finally at 70-something going vegan. But I mean, I was her daughter for like 30 years of being, or 26 years of being vegan, and it wasn't happening. I never once thought of my mother as a bad person. I just thought of her as somebody who has not stepped out, for whatever reason, has not been able to step out of this system. Now, when we separate character from behavior, this helps us to avoid what I refer to as reductive thinking. Reductive thinking is like reducing a person to nothing more than a behavior or a set of behaviors, right, and that we make a judgment about. So, you know, like when the best way to understand this is like when you're driving, somebody cuts you off, right? The person in that car is not a person with hopes and dreams and a life and a family, right? It's like the asshole driver. It's all they get, or even they might even be reduced to the car, like that white car. Reductive thinking often happens, you know, if we're sitting across from somebody who's eating animals. We can go automatically in our minds from this to this. So, you need to decide where you draw your line. You know, for some people, it really is intolerable to sit across from somebody who's eating animals, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's fine. Just pay attention to the psychology of reductive thinking. This also helps us to avoid all or nothing thinking. You know, I like to think of carnism and veganism on a continuum. I think that talking about, you know, whether somebody is a real vegan or not because they took a medication that had been tested on animals, or they ate a piece of soy cheese that had casein in it, it's a distraction from the issues that we really need to be focusing on, like the 77 billion land animals that are slaughtered every year for their flesh and other body parts. It also can really intimidate people and turn people off who are already thinking like, wow, it's a slippery slope. So if I go vegan, I'm like basically going to be holed up in my apartment, never be able to go out to eat again, and just become a, you know, miserable hermit. Now, we know that that's not the case. But people who are not familiar with veganism, who have just bought into the stereotypes, have a lot of fears that need to be assuaged by those of us who are ambassadors for the movement, who are representing the movement. If we represent our movement as one as ideological rigidity and impossible purity, and we shame people who don't adhere to these guidelines, it's a very, I mean, you don't need to be a psychologist to know this, it's a very good way to turn a lot of people off, the very people that we need to not turn off. I think it's helpful to think of carnism and veganism on a continuum, and there are various gradations. You know, you can be practice radical carnism where you're like eating meat all day long, you know, or you could be like a once a week person who's practicing carnism. Regardless, in my opinion, more important than where we're at on the continuum is where we're heading on the continuum. And as vegan advocates, if we can encourage people to move down the continuum, you know, with the clear goal, you know, ideally the goal is to not eat animals, to become vegan, but allow people to know that this is a process. Again, we have research that demonstrates that most people don't transition overnight. Most people transition gradually. Whether we think they should or shouldn't doesn't matter. It's just what is. It's the way that most people are psychologically oriented. We really need to work with the way people are psychologically, not the way we wish they were. So we encourage non-vegans to reflect on their line, the line they draw around the circle of compassion, right? So ask them to reflect on their line, ask them to draw their line in pencil. And we can build on existing compassion, like water the right seeds in people. This is the opposite of shaming. Shaming somebody is a great way to get them to do the opposite of what you're asking for. If you've ever been shamed, you know what I'm talking about, which is probably everybody in this room. I love this Buddhist saying that says, we all have within us the seeds of greed, hatred, and desire, and we also have within us the seeds of love, compassion, and empathy. Our job is simply to water the right seeds. We want to water the seeds that we want to grow in those to whom we're advocating, those we're communicating with, and just like as healthy, compassionate people in our lives. It's more effective, it's more strategic, and it's just, in my opinion, it's more ethical. It's more in alignment with our integrity, you know, practicing our own values of compassion and justice. So, you know, when I meet somebody, for example, who's a former vegan, has gone back to eating animals. I don't ask them, my first question is not like, oh my God, why'd you start eating meat again? My first question is, why did you become vegan in the first place? And generally, that question leads them to asking themselves, why did I start eating meat again? And how can I get back to being vegan in the first place? So this brings us to the final part of this presentation, which is on recognizing and attending to our own needs so that we can tamper that kind of emotional volatility. We can not be as emotionally volatile so that we can be more objective when we communicate. It's helpful to recognize that carnism, like other oppressive systems, uses, I describe this as a two-pronged strategy. Carnism is structured to strengthen itself, to validate carnism, right? It teaches us these myths, eating animals is normal, natural, and necessary. And it is also structured to do what? Exactly, to weaken veganism, right? In order for carnism to maintain itself, to survive, it's got to do both. It's got to strengthen itself and weaken the social movement that challenges it. It weakens veganisms by using what I refer to as secondary defenses. Primary defenses validate carnism, right? I talked about meat eaters looking at the world through the lens of carnism and believing these myths that they hear. Secondary defenses are myths that we hear about vegans, veganism, and the vegan movement. And these are myths that invalidate veganism and vegans. And many vegans are often looking at the world through the lens of secondary defenses. Secondary defenses are stories, they're myths that are designed to often to shoot the messenger, right? To basically convince people and also vegans that our message is not valid, to invalidate vegans, veganism, and the vegan movement. So I'll actually give you some examples of these. Secondary defenses are part of a backlash. Do you know what a backlash is? A backlash is the reaction of the dominant culture when its power is threatened. So, for example, in the 1970s, when the women's liberation movement started to really have an impact on society, on the broader society, men and women who had once proudly called themselves feminists ended up closeting themselves because feminist turned into a four-letter word. And even today, when we think of a feminist, we don't think of somebody who simply, believes in equal rights and essentially equal rights for men and women. We think of like a bra-burning, man-hating, I won't say the rest of it, but you know what I'm talking about. So the important thing to recognize about a backlash and secondary defenses, which are a part of it, is that secondary defenses evolve and intensify as the vegan movement evolves and intensifies. They're a sign of our success, not our failure. A good example is what we refer to in the US as so-called happy meat. You guys say organic meat, right? Or in Germany, we say bio-meat, Biofleisch. Same thing, right? Vegan activists all around the world have said to me over and over again, my God, this is so depressing. After all of our efforts, now we have to contend with happy meat? And I always say it's not in spite of our efforts, it's because of them. It's because we've been so successful. The meat industry, it's like a chess game. Social change is like a chess game. Imagine if we believed that every time we moved our, piece into a really powerful strategic position, and somebody fought back, the opponent fought back, we were like, oh, we must have screwed up there. The meat industry, meat, egg, and dairy industries are fighting back. Happy meat is simply a PR spin to get people to continue doing what they need them to continue doing. So we need to not internalize the negative messages that we hear about ourselves and negative stereotypes that we learn from, for example, secondary defenses. We're told that we're overly emotional. How many of you have heard this one? Right, okay, a lot of you. You're just overly emotional. But, if you think about it, the emotions of, sadness, anger, and grief are normal, legitimate, appropriate responses to the atrocity that is carnism. When it comes to eating animals and animal agriculture, the world needs more emotion, not less. We might be picky eaters because we won't pick the meat off the salad and then just eat around it. But, of course, if somebody who's not a vegan wouldn't pick off the, golden retriever on the salad. If we share information, we're propagandists. If other people share information, they're informing. So carnistic bias is built so deeply into the system. Most people don't recognize that when we, study nutrition, we essentially study carnistic nutrition. So anyway, now you know. Okay. We're hypocrites if we wear wool, and we're extremists if we don't. We're tree-hugging, tofu-loving hippies if we talk about peace. But if we express our anger, we're militant human haters. So these are the negative messages that we hear about ourselves, that we can internalize, and that can cause us to feel silenced. So don't try to be perfect, okay? One thing the dominant culture does, and it does this to members of all different types of, minority groups, including ideological minorities such as vegans, is to say that, basically you, in order to be, a positive representative of your group, you need to be perfect, right? So vegans, for example, are told that we have to be, paragons of health. We're not allowed to get sick. How many of you have ever pretended that you weren't sick when you were? Because you didn't want people to blame it on your diet, right? So you get a cold, and it's like, oh, it's the vegan diet, right? And the guy next door who's just had a quadruple bypass has bad genetics. So don't internalize this idea that we need to be perfect, or we don't need to be experts on everything, organic, veganic mushroom farming and agricultural economics. I mean, often when we're talking about veganism, it's like, okay, well, what about this? What do we do with the animals? And we feel like the message is that we only have a right to our ideology if we have all the answers to the problem that's carnism, which of course we don't. Don't try to be perfect. Perfectionism is a hallmark of dysfunctional thinking. It causes us to suffer tremendously. It causes other people to be afraid of becoming a part of a movement where perfectionism is so strongly upheld because, people who are perfectionistic are people who often are afraid of making mistakes. And people who are afraid of making mistakes are people who often end up doing nothing. So give yourself permission to be imperfect. The imperfect person that you are. It just makes life a whole lot easier. If you take a bite of something that had some animal in it, whatever your area of imperfection is, if you can not be hard on yourself, your life as a vegan and as an activist will quite likely be much more sustainable. Take a break from advocacy. How many of you are like, oh my God, coulda, shoulda, woulda. I had that person. They walked out, they're not vegan because I didn't tell them the right thing. It's exhausting. It's exhausting. Our job is to plant seeds. Colleen Patrick Goudreau says, another author, says, our job is really to plant seeds. Live your truth, model your truth, plant seeds. Share information, as much information as somebody asks for, allow other people to take it from there. If you feel like you have to advocate all the time, you're going to get exhausted. And you're going to feel the weight of the movement on your shoulders. Sometimes you just need to take a break. Sometimes you just want to go to that party and hang out and not be the vegan. Allow yourself to love non-vegans even if you don't love what they do. Now, this doesn't mean allowing people to disrespect you, but it doesn't make you a hypocrite to love non-vegans. I've seen a lot of suffering, and in my opinion, unnecessary suffering in the movement because somebody becomes vegan and all of a sudden they're unable to really feel connected with the people in their lives who haven't made that choice yet. Now, like I said, it's really important that you're respected in your veganism, that others do their best to understand your world as long as, you're trying to communicate that with them compassionately, that you maintain your connection. But just because somebody is eating animals, it doesn't make them a monster. And I think a lot of suffering in the movement could be prevented if vegans didn't feel like they were going to be sellouts, if they allowed themselves to maintain close relationships that were once so important to them with people who are not yet vegan. It's important in terms of our emotional stability to recognize STSD. You all probably have heard of PTSD, right? Post-traumatic stress disorder. STSD is exactly the same thing, except that it impacts people who are witnesses to violence rather than the direct victims of violence. And our movement, I actually have a whole other workshop just on STSD. Our movement is understandably riddled with people who are carrying around this trauma. And for some people, it's a lot of trauma. It comes from witnessing violence. It comes from living in a dominant, meat-eating society where we're surrounded by we're surrounded by reminders of the atrocity that is happening every second of every day. It is very difficult to live with that and to maintain an emotional equilibrium, but we need to, and there are ways to. I highly recommend this book. It's called Trauma Stewardship. And it's a book for activists from all different social justice movements about how to, certain attitudes and practices, self-care practices, so that you can both prevent SDS, I can't just say it, prevent it and treat it if you have it. I highly recommend that we pay attention to how much we're witnessing. Don't over-witness. I've heard so many vegans, come to me and they're just like all messed up and traumatized because they've seen Earthlings again. I'm like, why did you watch it again? Well, compared to what the animals go through, the least I can do is sit through a movie. It's not helping the animals. It's making you feel crazy. I mean, it's like horrible. I can't watch that stuff. I mean, I block it out every chance I get. It's one thing if you have to. It's your job. It's another thing if you're choosing to because you somehow think that your suffering is going to help animals suffer less. Often it's the opposite. Often the more you suffer because you're over-witnessing, the more traumatized you get, the more reactive you are when you're talking to people, the more you start seeing meat eaters as murderers, and the more burned out you're likely to get. It doesn't help the animals. Give yourself permission not to witness. Whenever you need not to witness, pay attention to what you need. This is very connected to committing to your own sustainability. Sustainability I define as taking in as much or more than what you give out, okay? On a practical level of your time, your energy, financially, on a psychological level where your attention is, and on an emotional level. Activists have a complicated relationship with needs. We tend to over-focus on the needs of others and the movement and under-focus on our own needs. And your primary relationship is with yourself. And just like in any relationship, if you have a partner who's not attending to your basic needs, you're going to feel deprived. You're going to feel resentful, you're going to feel disconnected, and the relationship is not going to be sustainable. It's exactly the same thing in how we treat ourselves. The best thing that we can do, in my opinion, besides learning effective communication, is to practice compassion towards self. I genuinely believe that if every single activist became more really committed to being compassionate towards themselves, it would transform the movement, and it would create a much more powerful movement. And remember, there's reason to hope. Carnism, is one of the carnistic's secondary defenses is denial of the fact that the vegan movement is one of the fastest growing social justice movements in the world today. And, I've given my talk on 5 continents. I have spoken to thousands and thousands of meat eaters, lots and lots of media, leaders of vegan organizations all around the world, and I have never seen a single exception to the fact that the vegan movement everywhere is on the rise. And it's growing faster than I ever thought it would be growing in my lifetime. So there's a lot of reason to hope. It's not going to be coming to your local news station anytime soon, but this is the truth that we need to be aware of and remind ourselves of to stay inspired. And finally, just remember that you're a part of something greater than your individual self. I mean, we are a part of a social movement that I believe will one day be looked back upon as one of the, if not the, most important and transformational social movements in human history. And that is an incredible thing. And the movement is still fairly young, so we're all pioneers. Every day you get up, you live your truth, you do what you believe in because it's the right thing to create a better world for all beings, despite the pressures, the overwhelming pressures to conform to the carnistic norm. You're not doing that for no reason. You're making a difference. It's because of you that the world is changing. And there's a lot of reason to hope, and there's also a lot of reason to be proud that we are part of this amazing social movement and that we're creating this just vitally important change in the world. So I want to just wrap up by thanking you for changing the world. So thank you.